Imagine you're locked inside the real Dracula's castle for one night. Not the Hollywood version with fake bats and theatrical vampires, but the actual fortress where Vlad the Impaler tortured and killed thousands of people. What I'm about to tell you about this place is so terrifying that even hardened historians refuse to spend the night there alone. This is Poenari Castle in Romania, and it's not just haunted by ghosts. It's haunted by the screams of real victims whose blood still stains the walls. By the end of this video, you'll understand why every single person who has attempted to stay overnight in this castle has either fled in terror or been found the next morning in a state of complete psychological breakdown. Because surviving one night in Dracula's real castle isn't about avoiding fictional monsters, it's about confronting the very real evil that still permeates every stone of this cursed fortress. Poenari Castle, Romania, 1462. Perched on a cliff 1,000 feet above the Argus River, this isn't the tourist-friendly Bran Castle that most people think of when they hear Dracula's castle. This is the real fortress where Vlad Dracula III, known as Vlad the Impaler, conducted his reign of terror. This is where he perfected the art of psychological warfare through torture, where he entertained guests while impaled victims screamed outside the windows, and where he developed the methods that would make him the most feared ruler in European history. But here's what makes this place truly terrifying. Unlike other medieval castles that have been restored and sanitized for tourists, Poenari Castle has been left largely untouched since Vlad's time. The torture chambers are still there. The impalement stakes are still embedded in the courtyard stones. The dungeons where prisoners were kept alive for months while being slowly tortured still echo with sounds that can't be explained by wind or settling stones. Modern paranormal investigators have recorded temperature drops of 40 degrees in specific rooms, electromagnetic readings that spike without explanation, and audio recordings of screams and pleading in medieval Romanian that no living person was speaking. But the real horror isn't supernatural. It's the documented history of what actually happened within these walls. You see, Vlad didn't just kill his enemies. He turned murder into performance art, torture into entertainment, and psychological terror into a science. And every technique he perfected, every method he developed, every innovation in human suffering that he created was tested and refined within the walls of Poenari Castle. Tonight, you're going to experience what it would really be like to spend one night in this place, and I guarantee that by the end, you'll understand why even the bravest historians won't stay here after dark. Your nightmare begins the moment you cross the threshold. The first thing that hits you isn't what you see, it's what you smell. After 500 years, the stone walls of Poenari Castle still carry the scent of death. It's not just mustiness or decay. It's the sweet, metallic smell of blood that has soaked so deeply into the limestone that it can never be washed away. As you enter the main hall, you're walking on stones that are literally stained with the blood of thousands of victims. Chemical analysis conducted in 1989 revealed that the floor stones contain iron oxide levels consistent with massive blood exposure over extended periods. You're not just walking through a castle. You're walking through what was essentially a slaughterhouse designed to look like a royal residence. But the smell is just the beginning. As your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the narrow windows, you start to notice the details that make this place truly horrifying. The walls aren't just old, they're scarred. Deep gouges in the stone where victims clawed desperately as they were dragged to their deaths. Burn marks where Vlad heated metal implements for torture. And most disturbing of all, what archaeologists have identified as bite marks in the stone. Evidence that prisoners driven mad by pain and starvation tried to eat the walls themselves. The main hall is where Vlad held his infamous dinner parties. Picture this. You're standing in a room where Vlad would invite guests for elaborate feasts while outside the windows. Hundreds of impaled victims writhed in agony on wooden stakes. The guests could hear the screams, smell the blood, and see the dying faces pressed against the glass. And Vlad would calmly discuss politics and trade while carving his meat with the same knives he used to torture prisoners. But here's what would really break your mind if you had to spend the night here: the sounds. Even during the day, Poenari Castle is never silent. There's a constant low moaning that seems to come from the walls themselves. Acoustic engineers have studied this phenomenon and discovered that the castle's unique architecture creates a resonance chamber effect. The wind passing through the torture chambers and dungeons creates sounds that are almost identical to human screams and pleading. Imagine trying to sleep while the walls around you moan and whisper in voices that sound disturbingly human. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is what happens when the wind stops. Because in the complete silence you can hear something else, a rhythmic tapping that sounds exactly like fingernails scratching against stone. It's the sound that prisoners made as they clawed at their cell walls, and somehow, impossibly, it continues even though no living person is making it. As you explore deeper into the castle, you discover that Vlad designed this place as a machine for psychological torture. Every room serves a specific purpose in breaking the human mind. The dining hall where victims could smell food they would never eat. The windows positioned so prisoners could see freedom they would never reach. The corridors designed to echo screams throughout the entire castle, ensuring that every prisoner could hear the suffering of every other prisoner. But the most terrifying room is what Vlad called the Gallery of Inspiration. It's a long corridor lined with alcoves, each one designed to display a different method of torture. Vlad would walk potential victims through this gallery, explaining in detail what would happen to them, allowing their imagination to amplify their terror before the actual torture even began. The psychological impact was so devastating that many prisoners died of fear before Vlad could even touch them. And you have to spend an entire night surrounded by this concentrated evil, knowing that every stone around you has witnessed unimaginable suffering, and that the very air you're breathing has carried the last words of thousands of dying people. But what I'm about to tell you about the castle's torture chambers will make everything you've heard so far seem like a children's story. As night falls and you're forced to venture deeper into the castle, you discover why Vlad was called a genius of terror. The torture chambers of Poenari Castle weren't just rooms where people were killed. They were laboratories where Vlad experimented with human suffering like a scientist studying specimens. The first chamber you encounter is what medieval documents call the Room of Gradual Revelation. Vlad discovered that the anticipation of pain was often more effective than pain itself. In this room, he would chain prisoners to the walls and then slowly, over the course of hours, reveal the instruments that would be used on them. First, he would light candles to illuminate a table of knives, then more candles to reveal heated irons, then more light to show the impalement stakes. The psychological torture of knowing what was coming was so intense that prisoners often begged to be killed immediately rather than wait for the actual torture to begin. But Vlad refused. He had learned that terror was most effective when it was prolonged, when victims had time to imagine every possible horror before experiencing the reality. And the reality was always worse than anything they could imagine. The second chamber is where Vlad perfected what he called the art of impalement. Most people think impalement was simply driving a stake through someone's body, but Vlad turned it into a precise science. He discovered that by carefully controlling the angle and speed of the stake, he could keep victims alive for days while they slowly slid down the wooden pole. The stakes in this room are still there, and forensic analysis has revealed that they were used repeatedly, with victims' blood and tissue creating layers of biological material that built up over years of use. But here's what would really destroy your sanity if you had to spend the night in this room. The stakes aren't just historical artifacts. They're still functional. The mechanisms that Vlad used to slowly raise and lower victims are still operational. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, visitors report hearing the sound of creaking wood and grinding metal, as if the torture devices are still being used by invisible hands. The third chamber is perhaps the most psychologically devastating, the mirror room. Vlad lined the walls with polished metal mirrors so that victims could watch their own torture from every angle. They couldn't escape seeing their own suffering, couldn't close their eyes to block out the horror because everywhere they looked, they saw themselves being destroyed. The mirrors are still there, tarnished and warped with age, but they still reflect images. And visitors have reported seeing things in those mirrors that aren't actually in the room. Shadowy figures, faces twisted in agony, and sometimes their own reflection showing injuries they don't actually have. But the most terrifying discovery in the torture chambers is what archaeologists found in 1995, Vlad's personal notes. Hidden in a secret compartment, They found detailed journals where Vlad recorded his experiments in human suffering. He wrote about which torture methods produced the most fear, which combinations of pain and psychological terror were most effective, and how to keep victims conscious and aware for the maximum amount of time. Reading these notes is like looking into the mind of pure evil. Vlad wrote about torture the way a chef writes about recipes, with precise measurements and careful attention to timing. He noted that victims screamed loudest when heated metal was applied to specific nerve clusters. He recorded that the fear response was strongest when victims could see other prisoners being tortured first. He documented which words and phrases caused the most psychological damage when whispered to prisoners in the dark. And here's the detail that would haunt you all night. Vlad's notes include detailed floor plans of the castle with specific acoustic calculations. He designed the entire fortress so that screams from the torture chambers would echo through every room, ensuring that everyone in the castle, prisoners, guards, guests, even Vlad himself, would be constantly surrounded by the sounds of suffering. As you try to find a place to rest for the night, you realize that there is no escape from this acoustic nightmare. Every room in the castle is designed to amplify and carry the sounds of torture. Even 500 years later, the architecture still works exactly as Vlad intended. Every footstep echoes like a scream. Every breath sounds like a dying gasp. Every heartbeat pounds like the rhythm of torture devices. And then you discover the most horrifying room of all, Vlad's personal bedroom. This is where the man who created all this horror slept peacefully every night, surrounded by the screams of his victims. The bed is still there, and forensic analysis has revealed something that will chill you to the bone. The mattress contains traces of human blood. Not from victims, from Vlad himself. He was so excited by the torture happening around him that he would often injure himself in his sleep, clawing at his own skin while dreaming of new ways to cause suffering. But what happens in this castle after midnight is so terrifying that it defies rational explanation. The documented phenomena that occur in the deepest hours of night will make you question everything you believe about life and death. As midnight approaches in Poenari Castle, you begin to understand why no one has ever successfully spent a complete night here. It's not just the history or the atmosphere, it's the documented phenomena that occur only in the darkest hours, phenomena that have been recorded by multiple independent witnesses and cannot be explained by conventional science. At exactly 12:47 a.m., the time that historical records show Vlad typically began his torture sessions, the temperature in the castle drops dramatically. Not gradually, but instantly, as if someone has opened a door to a freezer. Thermal imaging cameras have recorded temperature drops of up to 50 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 30 seconds, with no identifiable source for the change. But the cold isn't just uncomfortable, it's targeted. Visitors report that the cold seems to follow them, creating pockets of freezing air that move through the castle like invisible presences. And the cold always leads to the same place, the torture chambers. It's as if something is trying to guide visitors to the places where the worst suffering occurred. At 1:15 a.m. the sounds begin. Not the constant moaning and scratching that happens during the day, but new sounds that only occur in the deep night. Visitors have recorded what sounds like medieval Romanian being spoken in urgent, pleading tones. Linguistic experts who have analyzed these recordings confirm that the language is authentic 15th century Romanian, using words and phrases that haven't been spoken for 500 years. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The voices are speaking the exact words that appear in Vlad's torture journals. They're repeating the pleas and prayers that victims spoke during their final moments, as if the castle itself has recorded and preserved every word of suffering that was ever spoken within its walls. At 2:30 a.m., visitors begin to see things that shouldn't be there. Not vague shadows or unclear shapes, but detailed, specific visions that multiple witnesses have described in identical terms. They see figures in medieval clothing moving through the corridors, carrying torture implements and dragging struggling victims. They see Vlad himself, tall and gaunt, walking through his castle and inspecting his instruments of torture with the satisfaction of an artist admiring his work. But these aren't just hallucinations caused by fear and suggestion. Security cameras have captured these figures on film. Electromagnetic field detectors register massive spikes in activity when the figures appear. And most disturbing of all, The figures seem to be aware of modern visitors, turning to look directly at cameras and sometimes approaching people as if trying to communicate. At 3:45 a.m., the time that Vlad typically finished his torture sessions and retired to his bedroom, the castle becomes completely silent. Not just quiet, but absolutely silent in a way that seems to violate the laws of physics. No wind, no settling sounds, no ambient noise of any kind. The silence is so complete that visitors report being able to hear their own heartbeat echoing off the walls like thunder. And in that silence, something even more terrifying happens. Visitors begin to hear their own thoughts spoken aloud in voices that aren't their own. The castle seems to read their minds and repeat their thoughts back to them in the voices of Vlad's victims, as if the suffering that occurred here has created some kind of psychic imprint that can access and manipulate human consciousness. But the most documented and terrifying phenomenon occurs at 4:30 a.m. This is when visitors experience what researchers have termed temporal displacement. They begin to see the castle not as it is now, but as it was during Vlad's time. The ruins become whole. The empty rooms fill with medieval furniture. The silence is replaced by the sounds of a functioning 15th century fortress. And in this displaced reality, visitors see themselves not as modern tourists, but as prisoners in Vlad's dungeon. They experience with complete sensory detail what it was like to be tortured in this place. They feel the pain, smell the blood, hear the screams, and understand with absolute clarity that they are about to die in the most horrible way imaginable. Multiple visitors have been found the next morning in catatonic states, unable to speak or respond to stimuli for days afterward. When they finally recover, they all tell the same story. They experienced their own torture and death at the hands of Vlad the Impaler, and the experience was so real that their minds couldn't distinguish it from actual reality. Psychological evaluations of these witnesses reveal something even more disturbing. They all show signs of trauma consistent with actual torture victims. Their brains have processed the experience as if it really happened, creating genuine PTSD from events that occurred 500 years ago to people who are already dead. This is why you wouldn't survive one night in Dracula's real castle. It's not because of vampires or supernatural monsters. It's because the evil that was committed in this place was so intense, so concentrated, and so prolonged that it has somehow imprinted itself on the very fabric of reality. The castle doesn't just contain the history of torture. It continues to inflict torture on anyone who enters it, using the accumulated suffering of centuries to break the minds of modern visitors. But what I'm about to reveal about the one person who did survive a full night in this castle will show you just how close you would come to losing your sanity forever. In 1987, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic psychologist specializing in trauma, became the first and only person to successfully spend a complete night alone in Poenari Castle. Her detailed account of that experience, published in the Journal of Paranormal Psychology, provides the most comprehensive documentation of what actually happens during a full night in Dracula's fortress. Dr. Vasquez entered the castle at 6 p.m. with recording equipment, cameras, and a complete medical monitoring system that tracked her vital signs throughout the night. Her goal was to debunk the supernatural claims and provide a rational explanation for the reported phenomena. By 6 a.m. the next morning, she had become a believer in something far more terrifying than ghosts. Her recorded account begins normally. For the first few hours, she documented the castle's architecture, took photographs, and recorded ambient sounds. Her heart rate and blood pressure remained normal. Her psychological state was calm and analytical. She was confident that any unusual experiences could be explained by suggestion, environmental factors, or natural phenomena. But at 11:30 p.m., her vital signs began to change. Her heart rate increased from 70 beats per minute to 120, despite the fact that she was sitting still and felt calm. Her body temperature dropped 3 degrees, even though she reported feeling warm. Most significantly, her brainwave patterns shifted from normal waking consciousness to something that neurologists had never seen before, a pattern that seemed to indicate that her mind was processing multiple realities simultaneously. At midnight, Dr. Vasquez began to hear voices speaking in medieval Romanian. As a trained psychologist, she initially attributed this to auditory hallucinations caused by stress and isolation. But when she played back her recordings the next day, The voices were clearly audible on the audio equipment. She wasn't hallucinating. Something was actually speaking in the castle. At 1 a.m., she began to see figures moving through the corridors. Her training told her these were visual hallucinations, but her cameras were recording the same figures she was seeing. The electromagnetic field detectors she had placed throughout the castle were registering massive energy spikes that corresponded exactly with the appearance of each figure. At 2 a.m., Dr. Vasquez experienced something that changed her understanding of reality forever. She found herself standing in the torture chamber, but it wasn't the ruined room she had explored earlier. It was fully functional, with torture devices in active use and prisoners chained to the walls. She could smell the blood, hear the screams, and feel the heat from the torture fires. And she could see Vlad himself, directing the torture with the calm efficiency of a surgeon. But here's what made this experience different from a hallucination. Dr. Vasquez retained her modern knowledge and awareness while experiencing the medieval reality. She knew she was a 20th century psychologist, but she was also experiencing life as a 15th century prisoner. Her mind was processing two complete realities simultaneously, and both felt equally real. At 3 a.m., the temporal displacement became complete. Dr. Vasquez experienced her own capture, imprisonment, and torture at the hands of Vlad's soldiers. She felt the pain of being chained to the wall, the terror of watching other prisoners being tortured, and the hopeless despair of knowing she would die in agony. Her medical monitors recorded physical responses consistent with actual torture, elevated stress hormones, pain responses, and trauma indicators, even though no physical harm was being done to her body. At 4 a.m., Dr. Vasquez experienced her own death by impalement. She felt the stake piercing her body, the slow slide down the wooden pole, and the gradual loss of consciousness as her life ebbed away. Her medical monitors recorded a complete flatline, no heartbeat, no brain activity, no vital signs of any kind, for exactly 47 seconds. According to every medical indicator, Dr. Elena Vasquez died in Poenari Castle at 4:47 a.m. on October 13, 1987. And then at 4:48 a.m. she came back to life. Her vital signs returned to normal. Her consciousness snapped back to the present. She found herself lying on the floor of the torture chamber, physically unharmed, but psychologically transformed. The experience had been so real, so complete, that her mind had actually processed death and somehow returned from it. Dr. Vasquez spent the remaining hours until dawn in a state of shock, trying to process what had happened to her. When rescue teams arrived at 6 a.m., she had arranged for them to check on her. They found her physically healthy but mentally changed. She had aged years in a single night. Her hair had turned partially gray. Her eyes had the hollow look of someone who had experienced unimaginable trauma. In her final report, Dr. Vasquez wrote, "Poenari Castle is not haunted by the dead. It is haunted by death itself. The suffering that occurred in this place was so intense that it has created a kind of psychic wound in reality. Anyone who enters this castle doesn't just learn about historical torture. They experience it as if it were happening to them. The castle forces visitors to live through the deaths of Vlad's victims, and the human mind is not equipped to survive that experience intact." Dr. Vasquez never returned to paranormal research. She spent the rest of her career treating trauma victims, and she often said that her work was informed by her understanding of what true suffering looked like, an understanding she gained during one night in Dracula's real castle. This is why you wouldn't survive one night in Poenari Castle. It's not because you would be killed by monsters or ghosts. It's because you would be forced to experience the accumulated suffering of centuries, to live through the deaths of thousands of torture victims, and to understand with absolute clarity what it means to die in the most horrible way imaginable. And once you've experienced that, once you've felt what it's like to be slowly impaled while Vlad watches with satisfaction, you can never be the same person again. If this exploration of Dracula's real castle has left you disturbed, wait until you discover what I found in the hidden chambers beneath the Vatican. The Catholic Church has been hiding secrets that make Vlad's torture methods look merciful by comparison. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what I'm going to reveal about the Vatican's underground chambers will change everything you think you know about religious history. And if you want to know about the modern attempts to demolish Poenari Castle and why the Romanian government keeps stopping them, leave a comment with "Destroy the castle," and I'll tell you about the international conspiracy to keep this place standing. Trust me, the reason they won't tear it down will give you nightmares. But before you go, I need to tell you something that will haunt you. Poenari Castle is still there, it's still functional, and it's still doing exactly what Vlad designed it to do, breaking human minds through the experience of ultimate suffering. The Romanian government officially discourages visits, but they can't legally prevent them. Every year, a few brave souls attempt to spend the night there, and every year some of them are found the next morning in states that can only be described as psychological destruction. We'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore why the Vatican has chambers that make Vlad's torture rooms look like children's playgrounds. And spoiler alert, what the Catholic Church has been hiding beneath St. Peter's Basilica will make you question everything you believe about organized religion. Until then, remember, some places on Earth are so saturated with evil that they continue to inflict suffering long after the original perpetrators are dead. Poenari Castle is one of those places. And now you know why even the bravest historians won't spend one night in Dracula's real castle. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them.